Have you ever wondered what life would look like if we stopped counting the years and started counting the moments that truly took our breath away? Most people chase longevity, hoping to stretch the years, to outpace the ticking clock. But what if, just what if, the deeper secret is not about how long we live, but how fully we inhabit each precious day? Some might argue that life is a numbers game. The more years, the better. More success, more possessions, more milestones. And yet, those who have walked through nearly a century of sunrises and winters tell a quieter truth. It was never about the length of life. It was about the depth of presence. Today we open a doorway into a life lived not in endless motion, but in meaningful pauses, a journey of love that defied conventions, a resilience that survived grief without bitterness, a curiosity that remained undimmed even as time gently weathered the body, and the simple, often forgotten art of truly savoring existence. You might find yourself nodding along, feeling the resonance of these lessons, or you might find yourself questioning, is it really possible to live without regrets? Either way, this reflection invites you not to agree or disagree, but to listen with your heart open. So take a deep breath, slow down, feel the quiet thrum of life under your skin, because in the soft turning of these next few moments, we will not be chasing time. We will be gently rediscovering the timeless wisdom of living fully, no matter what the clock says. Let us begin. Part 1. The Art of Staying Curious. There is a quiet misconception that curiosity belongs only to the young, that it fades naturally as hair turns silver and bones begin to ache. But if you have ever truly watched someone who has lived fully into their later years, you would see something different. You would see that curiosity is not measured by the agility of the body, but by the openness of the heart. The slower steps of age do not necessarily mean slower wonder. In fact, sometimes as the body softens and the mind sheds its urgency, curiosity blossoms more fully, like a late summer rose that blooms just before the first frost. The Buddha once said, "Just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life." A spiritual life at its heart is nothing more and nothing less than the willingness to be awake to the world, to meet each day not as a repetition of the last, but as a new chapter yet to be written. In the quiet spaces of old age, when careers have ended and the children have long since built lives of their own, we are given a rare opportunity to return to the purest form of wonder, the kind we knew as children watching ants build their tiny empires in the cracks of the sidewalk. Curiosity is not about chasing after newness for its own sake, nor about filling the mind with endless information. It is the gentle art of leaning into each moment with an open heart, of listening to the rain against the windowsill as if hearing it for the first time. It is the ability to sit with a cup of tea in the late afternoon sun and find in the steam rising from the cup an entire universe of small sacred miracles. In Buddhist practice, this quality of attentive openness is called vimutti, liberation, not from the world, but within it. Liberation arises not from having all the answers, but from living inside the questions without fear. I once heard a story from the Zen tradition. A young monk, eager to impress, asked his elderly teacher why he continued to meditate so faithfully after decades of practice. The old man simply smiled, eyes twinkling like lanterns in the dusk, and replied, "Because the bamboo still bends in the wind, because the stream still sings beneath the stones." That is the heart of staying curious, not a frantic seeking, but a soft willingness to be touched again and again by the ordinary wonders that most people rush past without seeing. As we grow older, it becomes tempting to retreat behind walls of certainty, to imagine we have seen it all, heard it all, felt it all. But what a sorrowful way to finish this precious fleeting life. Far better, I think, to be like the mountain that watches the seasons change without clinging, or the river that welcomes each new rain without regret. Staying curious does not require strength of limb. It requires strength of spirit. It requires the humility to admit that there is always more to learn, more to feel, more to marvel at. When curiosity stays alive within us, even the smallest acts, watching a child play with a crumpled leaf, feeling the coolness of the morning air on our skin, noticing the way a familiar song still moves something inside us, become gateways to wonder. In a world that grows louder and faster with each passing year, choosing to remain curious is an act of quiet rebellion, a whisper to the universe that says, I am still here, I am still open, I am still willing to fall in love with this life. And perhaps that is the greatest teaching of all, that no matter how many birthdays we have celebrated, no matter how many losses we have endured, there is always something new waiting just beyond the next breath, if only we have the courage to keep looking. Part 2. The Power of Letting Go. In the soft autumn of our lives, there comes a moment, perhaps subtle, perhaps earth-shaking, when we realize that holding on too tightly only makes the inevitable changes more painful. We spend so much of our early years grasping, reaching for success, clutching relationships, stockpiling memories and mementos, as if they could anchor us against the inevitable tide of time. But sooner or later, life begins to loosen our fingers one by one, asking us, sometimes gently, sometimes with heartbreak, to let go. The Buddha spoke of this often. In the Dhammapada, he reminds us, attachment is the root of suffering. It is not love, not joy, not even ambition that causes us pain. It is the desperate clinging, the refusal to flow with life's endless rivers of change. Letting go does not mean giving up. It does not mean becoming indifferent or cold. Rather, it is the sacred art of releasing our need for control, of trusting the seasons to turn without our permission. I once sat with a woman who, in her early 80s, had just lost her lifelong home, a place filled with laughter, Sunday dinners, the marks on the doorframe where each grandchild's height had been measured. As she packed the last box, she did not curse the unfairness of it. She did not weep for what was leaving her. She simply ran her fingers along the chipped paint of the kitchen wall and whispered, "Thank you." In that small act, she taught me more about impermanence than any sermon could. Letting go, in truth, is an act of great bravery. It asks us to meet our grief without being swallowed by it. It invites us to honor what was beautiful without insisting it stay unchanged. Like a tree in autumn, releasing its leaves not in despair, but in trust that spring will come again. We are called to surrender what no longer serves our growth. And yet, how often do we resist? We hold on to old grievances, nurturing them like wounds we are afraid to heal. We cling to possessions we no longer need, convinced they contain pieces of our identity. We replay conversations, regrets, and what-ifs, as if through sheer repetition we might change their endings. But clinging is a heavy burden. It slows our steps, dims our spirit, and blinds us to the beauty still unfolding all around us. In Buddhist mindfulness practice, there is a teaching known as non-grasping awareness, a way of being that touches life lightly, tenderly, without clutching. It is the spirit of walking barefoot through a dewy field at dawn, feeling everything, holding nothing too tightly. This is not passivity, it is presence. It is saying to life, I will love fully, knowing all things are passing. Imagine the freedom of carrying less. Imagine meeting each morning, not burdened by yesterday's weight, but open, light as a bird rising into a pink sky. Letting go is not a loss. It is a return to the breath, a return to the simple miracle of being alive, without the heavy armor of old sorrows and worn-out dreams. An old Zen saying captures it perfectly: let go or be dragged. We can cling and be torn apart by the changes life brings, or we can let go and be carried gently into the next unfolding chapter. In the quiet wisdom of our later years, we begin to see the tighter we hold, the more fragile we become. But when we release, we step into a spaciousness where life can meet us anew, full of unexpected gifts, full of tender beginnings we had thought were long behind us. And perhaps, in the end, letting go is not about losing anything at all. It is about gaining the only thing that was ever truly ours to keep, the peace that comes from finally, tenderly trusting the flow of life itself. Part 3. The secret of long friendships. There is a rare, almost sacred beauty in the friendships that endure, not just across seasons but across decades. They are the quiet witnesses to our becoming, the mirrors that show us both who we were and who we are still trying to become. And yet, in a world that seems to spin faster with each passing year, these enduring bonds are not born of accident. They are tended like gardens, patiently, lovingly, and with an understanding that storms will come, and seasons of drought will test even the strongest roots. In Buddhist tradition, spiritual friendship, or kalya spinita, is regarded as essential to walking the path. The Buddha himself once said, "Admirable friendship, admirable companionship, admirable camaraderie is actually the whole of the holy life, not a small part, not an optional grace note, the whole of it, because, in truth, we do not awaken alone. We awaken together." I once knew two women, both in their 80s, who met when they were barely 20. Over the course of 60 years, their lives twisted and turned in ways neither could have foreseen: marriages, losses, illnesses, reconciliations. There were periods when they did not speak for months, even years. But somehow, like a river finding its way back to its source, they always returned to one another. Over tea, over letters written with shaky hands, over the simple exchange of presents. When I asked them once how they had managed to keep their friendship alive through so much change, one of them smiled and said, "We forgave each other every time we needed to, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." And there it is, the quiet secret of long friendships. Forgiveness. Not the grand, dramatic forgiveness of movie scenes, but the daily, humble forgiveness of small slights, forgotten birthdays, differences of opinion. It is the willingness to say, "You hurt me, and then I still choose you." It is recognizing that perfection was never the point, that what matters is the shared history, the mutual choosing, the heart that says, "You are my person," even when it's messy. But friendship also demands tending. It asks that we show up, not just in times of crisis, but in the ordinary Tuesdays of life. It asks that we listen, not to respond, but to understand. It asks that we celebrate each other's joys as if they were our own, and sit quietly with each other's grief when no words can fix it. True friendship, like any living thing, requires nourishment. A phone call, a handwritten note, a simple "I was thinking of you." In the later years of life, when so much falls away, careers, titles, youthful ambitions, it is often our friendships that remain, golden threads woven through the fabric of our days. They remind us that we were seen, that we were loved, not for our achievements, but simply for who we are. They become a soft place to land, a sanctuary in a world that can sometimes feel bewildering and unkind. And yet, Making new friendships as we age can feel daunting. The walls we built to protect ourselves can also keep others out. But the teachings remind us that a closed heart is a lonely heart. To have a friend, we must be a friend, vulnerable, open, willing to reach out first. It is never too late to cultivate new connections. Even a smile exchanged with a stranger at the market, even a shared laugh over a forgotten name, can be the beginning of something quietly extraordinary. There's a gentle Zen koan that asks, who is carrying whom? In friendship, the answer is always, we carry each other back and forth, sometimes giving more, sometimes needing more, but always bound by the invisible, luminous thread of shared humanity. And perhaps, at the very end, when memory fades and titles are forgotten, it will not be the accolades or possessions we cling to, but the faces of those who loved us without condition, the friends who stayed, the friends who forgave, the friends who simply by being there made the long journey a little lighter. Part 4. Cultivating curiosity at every age. There's a quiet kind of aliveness that curiosity bestows upon the soul, a spark that refuses to be extinguished by the mere passage of time. As the body grows older and slower, as the world around us shifts in ways we scarcely recognize, curiosity is what keeps the spirit supple, bright, and beautifully unafraid. It is in many ways the secret doorway to lifelong vitality. The Buddha taught that the beginner's mind, Shoshin, as it is called in Zen, is the ground of wisdom. It is the mind that looks at each moment as if seeing it for the first time, free from the heavy burden of assumptions or wearied conclusions. As he once said, in the seeing, there is only the seen; in the hearing, only the heard. True presence requires a soft wonder, an openness to meet each experience as if it were a gift, not a task. I once met a woman in her late 90s who still began every morning by reading the newspaper cover to cover, sipping her coffee slowly as if the world might reveal some new miracle hidden among the ordinary headlines. She would grumble at the state of politics, marvel at scientific discoveries, chuckle over human interest stories. I don't read because everything is good, she once told me. I read because everything is alive, and as long as it's alive, it's worth knowing about. There was something profoundly Buddhist about the way she lived. She did not cling to nostalgia, nor did she shy away from the sadness of the world. Instead, she let her curiosity be the bridge, the quiet thread that stitched her heart to the present moment, no matter how uncertain or imperfect it might be. In our later years, curiosity often shifts form. It no longer demands grand adventures or worldly achievements. Rather, it becomes a tender noticing. It's the curiosity to wonder about the changing sky outside your window, the curiosity to ask a grandchild about their favorite song, the curiosity to try a new spice in an old recipe, or to listen, really listen, to someone whose life looks nothing like your own. And yet, it's so easy to let curiosity wither if we are not careful. The routines that once gave us comfort can harden into ruts. Fear of change can disguise itself as practicality. The voice that once asked, "Why not?" can be drowned out by, "What's the point?" But the Dharma gently reminds us that life itself is a river, always flowing, always changing, and it is not resistance but openness that allows us to move with it. There's a simple practice from Buddhist teachings called beginner's eyes. Each morning, for just a few moments, you close your eyes, take a deep breath, and when you open them, pretend you have never seen the world before. Look at your hands, your room, the light filtering through the curtains, the wrinkles at the corners of your own eyes, as if witnessing them for the very first time. You might be surprised how everything shimmers with a quiet beauty you had stopped noticing. Cultivating curiosity, especially after 60, is not about trying to remain young in the superficial sense. It is about remaining deeply alive. It is about realizing, as the Buddha so often taught, that each day is a little life, and what a tragedy it would be to sleepwalk through even a single one. In the end, curiosity is a kind of love, a way of leaning toward the world instead of away from it, of saying with every question, every new attempt, every open-hearted wonder, I am still here, I am still listening, I am still willing to be amazed. And truly, isn't that what it means to live fully, no matter how many candles flicker on the birthday cake? Part 5. Letting go of regret. Gracefully. There is a heaviness that regret carries, a silent, persistent weight that can follow us across the years if we let it. It clings not to the body, but to the spirit, gnawing at the edges of our peace, with questions that have no real answers. What if? Why didn't I? If only, left unattended, these quiet sorrows can harden into invisible chains, pulling us further and further away from the gentle freedom available right here, right now. The Buddha understood the human tendency to cling to the past. Do not dwell in the past, he taught. Do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment. And yet, telling the heart to simply forget its regrets is like telling the ocean to still its tides. It does not work by force. It works by understanding, by a soft, steady practice of release. I once sat with an elderly man during a quiet afternoon tea at a temple gathering. His hands, wrinkled and warm, trembled slightly as he confessed, I have lived a good life, but there are mistakes I made, moments I can't stop replaying in my mind, things I would give anything to undo. His voice cracked slightly, and then he paused, gazing out at the garden, where golden leaves were falling gently to the ground. After a long silence, he whispered, maybe forgiveness isn't just about others. Maybe it's about forgiving myself for being human. There was a profound wisdom in his words. Buddhist teachings do not shy away from the truth of imperfection. Instead, they invite us to meet it with metta, loving kindness, especially toward ourselves. Every misstep, every harsh word, every missed opportunity becomes, if we allow it, a part of the great tapestry of our becoming. It does not define us, it refines us. The Dharma speaks often of the practice of Kshanti, or patience, not just patience with the world, but with our own slow growth. As one Zen proverb gently reminds us, the snow falls, each flake in its proper place. So too do our regrets settle into the landscape of our lives, not to be erased, but to be softened, understood, and ultimately forgiven. One simple practice when the past tugs painfully at your heart is this. Close your eyes, place a hand over your chest, and whisper inwardly, I was doing the best I could with what I knew at the time. Say it again, slowly, as if speaking to the tenderest part of yourself, because chances are, it's true. And even if mistakes were made in anger, ignorance, or fear, the path forward is never paved by punishment, only by compassion. Letting go of regret does not mean pretending that nothing hurt. It does not mean denying the real harm or sorrow that might have come. It means accepting, deeply and honestly, that the past cannot be changed, and that your duty now, your sacred task, is to live the next breath, the next hour, the next day, with greater tenderness, because of what you have seen, felt, and learned. In the end, the river of life flows in only one direction, forward, and every moment we spend staring backward at the stones we stumbled upon is a moment we are not noticing the beauty of the water sparkling around us now. The Buddha once said, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. And perhaps, when we finally believe that, not just as an idea, but as a truth stitched into our very being, regret loosens its grip. It dissolves like mist under a rising sun, leaving behind not a perfect life, but a peaceful heart. And that, dear one, is worth everything. Part 6. Finding purpose beyond achievement. There comes a quiet moment, often after the titles have faded and the accolades have turned to dust, when one stands at the edge of a new kind of landscape, a place where achievement no longer defines worth, and the question arises, if I am not what I accomplish, then who am I? This crossroads can be unsettling. For decades, we are taught to measure our value by the milestones we reach. Careers built, families raised, goals conquered. Yet as the seasons of life ripen and slow, it becomes clear that a deeper kind of purpose awaits, one not built of doing but of being. The Buddha, long before modern psychology gave language to this experience, spoke of right livelihood, not merely in terms of earning a living, but in living rightly. He pointed again and again to the inner work, the cultivation of compassion, patience, generosity, and wisdom as the true measures of a life well lived. Your work is to discover your work, he said, and then with all your heart to give yourself to it. And sometimes that work shifts as we ourselves are reshaped by time. I remember a woman I once met at a forest retreat, her hair silvered with years, her eyes still bright with wonder. She had spent her younger life climbing the ladders of success, managing offices, winning awards, living at a pace so fast, she said, she barely noticed the seasons changing outside her windows. But when retirement arrived, she confessed, she felt hollow, unmoored. I realized, she said softly, I had built a life around doing so much that I had forgotten how to simply be. And so she began again, not with grand gestures, but with small acts of soulful attention, tending a neglected garden, reading to children at the library, listening without judgment to those around her. Slowly, a new kind of purpose grew, quieter, perhaps invisible to the world, but profoundly alive inside her. Purpose, she discovered, wasn't about what others could see. It was about what her own heart could feel. Buddhist philosophy teaches us that Dharma, our true path, is often less about striving and more about attuning. Like a musician learning to listen more deeply to the music between the notes, we are called to notice where our presence brings lightness, where our small acts ripple outward, unseen but undeniable. One simple meditation to reconnect with purpose is to sit quietly each morning and ask, what brings warmth to my heart today? Where can I offer gentleness? The answers may not always come immediately, but over time, like a well-tended fire, a steady glow begins to grow within. It could be writing a letter to an old friend, baking a pie for a neighbor, planting a tree whose shade you may never sit under. It could even be the unseen labor of forgiveness, tending to old wounds not for applause, but because a lighter heart blesses the world far beyond what the eye can measure. In this later season of life, purpose no longer shouts, it whispers. It nudges us to live so that when the evening comes, not just the evening of a day, but the evening of a lifetime, we can smile gently, knowing that we gave not because we had to, but because love overflows its own cup. The Buddha once shared, as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life. And so finding purpose beyond achievement is really about recognizing that every moment is an invitation to live spiritually, not by withdrawing from the world, but by touching it more tenderly. And in this way, even the smallest day, a quiet cup of tea sipped with gratitude, A kind word offered without expectation becomes a sacred offering, a thread woven into the great invisible fabric of peace. Part 7. Choosing the right company. As the long river of life winds into quieter valleys, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The souls we choose to walk alongside us shape the very landscape of our final chapters. Companionship, after all, is not merely about sharing space. It is about sharing energy, about finding those whose presence tends to our spirit like rain to thirsty soil. There is a quiet wisdom in the Buddhist teaching of Kalyasha, the noble friendship. The Buddha himself once told his disciple, Yonanda, admirable friendship, admirable camaraderie is actually the whole of the holy life. It wasn't a casual comment. It was a sacred reminder that our spiritual growth is inseparable from the company we keep. In the later seasons of life, this teaching resonates even more tenderly. We find that it is not the quantity of relationships that nourishes us, but the quality. It is not the bustling crowds, the endless parties, or the accolades that matter. It is the few gentle souls who know how to sit with us in silence, who celebrate our joys without envy, who hold our grief without trying to fix it. I once met an elderly man at a meditation retreat tucked away in the redwoods. He was 82, his posture slightly stooped, but his laughter unshaken. Over a cup of strong, earthy tea, he shared a piece of quiet wisdom that has stayed with me. I spent the first half of my life chasing people who didn't know how to stay. Now I sit still and let only those who know how to listen find me. His eyes crinkled with a peace that only decades of learning could teach. Choosing the right company, then, becomes an act of profound compassion, both for ourselves and for others. It means releasing the heavy friendships that drain our spirit, even if they are long held. It means blessing those who walk a different path, without bitterness. And it means actively seeking or creating the kind of community where joy, resilience, and kindness can breathe freely. There is no shame in pruning the garden of our relationships. In fact, Buddhist tradition teaches that letting go, when done with clarity and love, is an act of mercy. Letting go gives us freedom, the Buddha said, and freedom is the only condition for happiness. Holding tightly to those who no longer nourish our soul only binds us to suffering. And so, perhaps now is the time to ask quietly, without judgment, who makes my heart lighter? Who inspires me to live more deeply? Who sees not just my face, but my soul? These are the companions to cherish. These are the friendships to water with attention, gratitude, and care. If loneliness arises, as it sometimes will, let us remember that true connection begins within. In meditation, we can become our own kind companions. We can be the gentle voice that says, I see you, I love you, I am here. And when we learn to befriend ourselves, when we walk the quiet fields of our own heart with tenderness, something miraculous happens. Others who walk the same path, the path of sincerity, presence, and peace, begin to appear, almost as if summoned by an unseen thread of shared longing. Choosing the right company is not about building walls. It is about tending doors that open inward and outward. It is about understanding that belonging has little to do with proximity and everything to do with resonance. And it is about trusting that in this wide, mysterious journey of being human, no matter our age or circumstance, there are always kindred spirits waiting just beyond the bend. In the end, it is not how many people remember our name that matters. It is how deeply we loved those who did. It is how willingly we stood witness to one another's becoming. And it is how gently we held each other's hands through the fleeting, fragile, beautiful seasons of life. Part 8. Embracing the gift of change. Change, such a small word for such a vast force. It brushes against our lives with every sunrise, every breath, every beat of the heart. And yet, for so many, especially as the years gather and settle softly on our shoulders, change can feel like an unwelcome visitor. It rattles our certainties, shifts the landscapes we once thought would stay the same, and leaves us reaching out for what feels familiar, even as it slips like water through our fingers. But what if, instead of resisting, we could greet change as an old friend, one who, although sometimes disruptive, has come bearing the very gifts our soul most needs? In Buddhist wisdom, impermanence, anicca, is not seen as a flaw of life, but as its deepest truth. The Buddha taught, all conditioned things are impermanent. When one sees this with wisdom, one turns away from suffering. Change is not a punishment, it is the heartbeat of existence itself. And when we open our hearts to this rhythm, life, rather than slipping away from us, begins to unfold with new and unexpected grace. I once listened to an elder, a woman with silver hair and a voice like soft rain, tell the story of her garden. For decades, she planted roses in the same patch of earth, believing them to be the crowning beauty of her home. Then, one winter, a rare frost swept through, killing every last rose. For a long time she mourned. The garden looked barren, unfamiliar, a landscape of loss. But slowly, wildflowers began to creep into the empty spaces. Bright bursts of color she had never planted, never planned. "It wasn't the garden I thought I wanted," she said, smiling, "but it turned out to be the garden I needed." Our lives, too, are gardens shaped by unseen seasons, loss, retirement, changing health, the shifting faces of those we love. These are not signs that life is ending. They are signs that life is transforming, inviting us into deeper, quieter fields of being. When we cling to what was, to the roles, the identities, the rhythms that once defined us, we suffer. But when we allow ourselves to soften, to listen, to adapt, we find a different kind of freedom. As the old saying in Zen reminds us, let go or be dragged. This does not mean pretending that change is easy. It is not. There will be days when the losses feel too sharp, when the unknown feels too wide. There will be mornings when grief sits heavily in the chest, and nights when the silence feels endless. But even in those moments, there is a quiet current of transformation moving through us, carving out space for something new, something we may not yet have words for, but that will in time become our next breath, our next step, our next beginning. One small practice the Buddha encouraged was the contemplation of change, not as a distant idea, but as a daily companion. When we drink our tea, noticing how its warmth fades. When we see the light shift across the walls, when we feel our own body, older now but still so achingly alive. Each of these is a teacher, whispering, you are part of this endless unfolding. You are not being left behind. You are being carried forward. And so, perhaps the invitation, as we grow older, is not to cling more tightly to the past, but to bow more deeply to the mystery ahead, to trust that the unknown, however unfamiliar, carries within it the same sacred breath that first brought us into this world. In welcoming change, we welcome life itself, messy, marvelous, unfinished. We allow ourselves to become beginners again, to open our arms wide to the unpredictable beauty of each new season. Because ultimately, change is not the end of the story. It is the doorway to becoming who we were always meant to be, not in spite of impermanence, but because of it. Part 9. Planting seeds of joy in the time we have. There comes a moment, often unannounced and softer than a whisper, when life offers a final, precious invitation to become a sower of quiet joy. Not the noisy kind that demands applause, but the gentle, lasting kind that settles into the hearts of others long after we are gone. It is a truth so simple that it often hides from the busyness of youth, revealing itself only when the calendar pages begin to feel thin in our hands. In the Buddhist tradition, there is a saying, "As a flower does not pick and choose the bees that come, so a wise person offers kindness freely." At this stage of life, joy is not found in grand achievements or accolades. It is found in small offerings, a warm smile to a stranger, a phone call to a distant friend, a soft word of encouragement to someone younger who is still stumbling through storms we have already weathered. I remember once sitting beside an old gardener who had spent decades tending a small public park. His hands were worn and his gait slow, but every morning he rose to sweep the pathways, trim the bushes, and plant wildflowers along the edges where no one had asked him to. When I asked him why he still bothered, especially now that his back ached and his knees complained, he smiled and said, "The seeds I plant today are for someone I may never meet, but someday they'll walk here and feel at home without knowing why." Isn't that the quiet legacy we all long to leave behind? To be part of someone's unexpected moment of peace. To create spaces in gardens, in hearts, in conversations, where life can root itself gently. The Buddha taught that merit, punya, is not only accumulated through rituals or charity given with a heavy heart. True merit is born from small, sincere acts of kindness performed with no expectation of return. A cup of tea offered in silence, a door held open, a hand rested on a trembling shoulder. These moments, like drops of water, wear away the stone of sorrow, slowly reshaping the world into something softer, more human. And so, in these later chapters of life, our role quietly shifts. We are no longer called to build empires or chase distant dreams. We are called to nurture, to soften, to plant. Each morning becomes an altar, each conversation a chance to bless, each act of patience a ripple that carries farther than we can see. If your hands are not as strong as they once were, let them still reach out with tenderness. If your voice has softened with age, let it carry words of encouragement. If your body moves more slowly, let your presence become an anchor for those who feel lost in the rush. Because in the end, the true measure of a life well lived is not how loudly we were heard, but how deeply we made others feel seen. As the Dhammapada reminds us, thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Let your light, however modest, touch as many as it can. Plant your seeds without counting the harvest. Scatter your joys without needing to witness their bloom. And in doing so, you will find that life, even in its twilight, remains breathtakingly full, a garden of endless beginnings. Conclusion: the quiet art of living well. As we reach the end of this quiet journey together, perhaps a gentle truth has begun to settle in your heart, that the beauty of life was never about the number of years we gather, but about the tenderness we pour into each unfolding moment. We've reflected on the importance of orienting ourselves toward simple joy instead of stress, of guarding our inner peace rather than chasing the endless noise of comparison. We spoke of love, not the fleeting kind, but the deep, unwavering presence that carries us across decades. We remembered the wisdom of patience when choosing a life partner, the quiet strength of independence cultivated from an early age, and the healing power of surrounding ourselves with vibrant souls who keep our hearts young. Through each reflection, a quiet thread weaves itself. Follow your heart, live with intention, and dare to choose a life that feels deeply true rather than one that merely looks successful. And so, dear friend, as you sit here, perhaps with the afternoon light softening through your window, I invite you to pause and ask yourself, what seeds of joy am I planting today? What dreams long tucked away are still calling quietly for me to answer? Remember, it is never too late. Not for love, not for laughter, not for small acts of courage, not for one more day lived with both hands open to wonder. If today's reflection stirred something inside you, a memory, a hope, a longing, I invite you to walk gently with it. Carry it into your next sunrise. Let it guide one choice, one smile, one act of forgiveness, and know that in doing so, you are living not just longer, but deeper. If you found peace in this quiet wisdom, I warmly invite you to subscribe to our channel. Here, we create a soft space for reflection, resilience, and the timeless art of living fully, no matter the season of life you are in. Until we meet again, may you walk slowly, breathe deeply, love fiercely, and above all, live awake.